Welcome to this week's sales framework for non-sales professionals. If you've been following along, you know that this framework is built for business owners, leaders, and professionals who engage in sales conversations, but don't fit the mold of a traditional salesperson in a traditional sales role. You're often selling in a context that requires patience, credibility, and alignment with the buyer's decision-making process. You may even be prioritizing a long-term relationship over a sale today. Now you can see how this would be a valuable approach for a coach or a consultant. In our last session, we covered the importance of rapport, pre-qualifying prospects, and conducting effective fact-finding to uncover their real motivations. Today, we take that foundation and move into execution, demonstrating your value, guiding the conversation toward a decision, and handling objections effectively. The demonstration phase is where you connect your offering directly to what matters most to the prospect. But it's not just about presenting facts. It's about framing your solution in a way that makes the decision feel natural and inevitable. In fact, it involves having the prospect tell you why and how the solution is a fit. Once the prospect experiences the value for themselves, closing becomes a logical next step. But for many non-sales professionals, this is also where hesitation can set in because of the need for an effective transition, and that's where the framework provides the right amount of structure. Finally, I'll walk you through common objections: wanting to shop around, needing more time, and of course, price. By the end of this session, you'll have the framework for a practical, repeatable approach to guide prospects toward a decision, ensuring they feel confident in choosing your solution. Now, whether you're selling services, securing investment, or getting support for a strategic initiative, mastering this part of the framework will make your conversations more effective and natural, which will result in more consistency and predictable outcomes. Let's dive in with a quick review. We talked about making sure that you're in the right state, and whatever that is, I'm not going to tell you what state is right for you. If you're coming away from a tough conversation with an employee, maybe a situation with the supplier, or just some bad news, whatever it is, we have to get out of that state and into a state that's productive for selling. I introduced a quick anchor, and I talked about using something high energy to get you into a state. I used the example of the wool clap that Tony Robbins uses. And it's not just a wool clap. I mean, it's really getting into it. It's your whole body and, just really making yourself feel that. And then anchoring some move that you can do before you walk up to the sales or walk into the salesperson or turn on the Zoom, whatever it is. And, I like the yes. And it's just a quick way for me to reset. That's important. And another thing you can do is, I've done this in meetings. I do it with myself. Something comes up and it's major and pressing. And you know how the mind can just take off running. It's literally making a conscious decision. You know what? I'm going to put that over here in a box, put the top on it, and I'm going to deal with it at noon. Or I'm going to deal with it after lunch. I'm going to put this over there to the side, put it in a box, and imagine yourself putting it into a box with the cover on it, and it's effective. You may have to try different words to make it work for you, but you are in control of your internal experience. There's nothing external that we're talking about that's affecting you. This is your neurons firing and wiring and looking for danger and looking for things that are scary. And so you're in control of that. You may not feel like you're in control, and I'll get into that next week. When you approach it from the way that the neurons work, then you'll see that you are in control. Out of scope for today, but the point is there are different options that we have to get to that state. And I'll talk about them again next week. We had the physiology. I mentioned it's not just the posture. It's not just matching physiology for rapport. Those things are important. But also having a slumping or defeated type physiology actually primes you for fight or flight. It's just the way that the neurons work. Remember, there's 100 billion of them in our system, 86 billion in the brain, another 14 billion throughout the body. And because it's associations and because they work both ways, if I get down with my posture, it's not long before my breathing gets shallow and I start thinking negative thoughts. If you're up and positive, smiling, and I use the example many books will say you can't smile and feel depressed at the same time. Now, you could trick yourself, obviously, but what the point that that statement is making is that the physiology thing goes both ways. Breathing, if you breathe in a shallow, fast way, it will heighten your stress. It primes you for a stress response, if not fully putting you into a stress response. Similarly, when you're stressed, our breathing gets shallow and quick. So again, it goes both ways, and I can't say enough about the physiology one. And then we have energy. I talked about positive. It should be positive, obviously not negative. That was the point in the beginning about you have to get out of the state that you're in if you're dealing with something difficult. You want to be fully present, and you can do that. You can change your state. You may not think you can, but you can. And then, so positive energy, and I talked about high and low. So there are times when we want that high positive energy, when you're tapping into the emotion and you're getting some enthusiasm going. High positive energy makes sense. But when you're letting the person work through something, you may slow it down. Still positive, but you've slowed it down. So it's like low positive energy. Allows them to think. And then we talked about mindset, and most people are familiar with growth and mindset. What people don't think about a lot is that there's a growth mindset and fixed mindset, but you can have a growth mindset and fixed mindset back and forth in the same topic. A growth mindset around nutrition and have a fixed mindset around certain aspects of nutrition, around certain foods. You can have a growth mindset around personal development and have a fixed mindset around affirmations or around meditation. And you could have a growth mindset around meditation, but have a fixed mindset around guided meditations or unguided meditations. So it's being aware. It's being aware of when you slip into a fixed mindset and then quickly changing. I talk about quickly. I'm talking instantaneously. As soon as you notice you're going into a fixed mindset, we have to change that. And I'll come back to that. That's a topic for next week as well, because you have to do it in the sales presentation. There are things that are going to come up in the fact finding that you weren't prepared to hear and you may not want to hear. And you could feel that fixed mindset coming on. You may not think of it as a fixed mindset. You may think of it as some anxiety or some disappointment or maybe some frustration or something along those lines, maybe vulnerability, whatever that is. And then people map those into anxiety. And this is why it's important to be able to label it so that you're not treating everything as anxiety. Some things are just, I wasn't expecting that. Well, there's no reason to be anxious about that. It's just something that you weren't expecting. So we'll get into that next week. And then the big one, I said priming is in the middle, because we're constantly being primed. We're priming the the prospect. The prospect is priming us. We're constantly in this priming space. And then we have the framework and the roadmap. So I said it's the overall framework, and I made some distinctions around the methodology versus the process. But this framework is flexible, so whatever you sell, whatever kind of conversation you're in, you can use this framework, because it's a framework based on how people like to buy, how people make decisions, and how we're interacting with them to get to that decision. So I had pre-call, and pre-call is what we just talked about. Then we get into the pre-qualify, and that's where we started in the framework itself. We said that when we're pre-qualifying, we're not qualifying or pre-qualifying to a yes or a no. We're pre-qualifying to, do I continue, do I delay and schedule, or do I delay and revisit? As if I'm talking to a sales manager, they're not really interested in having their salesperson push the thing off, because they know that a lot of these people who don't look like they're ready end up buying. And that's the salesperson's job, is to get the reps, just keep going through the reps. It becomes a numbers game. So you've got to get the top of the funnel filling up. But if you are a coach or a consultant, or you have a long-term arrangement with the prospect, and you're either upselling them or selling them on the next, or renewing, or maybe it's an investor and you're making a pitch for some additional funding, you are going to prioritize that relationship. If they're not in a good space to talk about it, you can delay and schedule, or delay and revisit. It just depends. And again, as the owner, you're more likely in a situation where you are more concerned about the relationship and the satisfaction for clients and prospects than you are about making a sale right now today. Also, your sales may be a little bit larger that you're making, which means a longer sales cycle, which means you'll be revisiting some of this more regularly. Then we had fact-finding part 1 and fact-finding part 2. I used the SPIN, situation, problem, implication, and need payoff questions. We didn't talk about the need payoff. That's what we talk about today because that's more in the demonstration side. But I talked about fact-finding at the public level, the public persona, and then fact-finding at the private persona. So we want to constantly be earning the right, and we talked about continuously building rapport, know, like, and trust, and connection so that you have the right to ask those deeper, private type questions. And I made the distinction, we're not going to get into the secret stuff, obviously, in a sales situation. And then we stopped here, and that's, I call that the hard stop, because we've got to do another readiness check or temperature check to see if we should be going forward. In addition to SPIN, and I mapped it together because in the SPIN, in situation and problem, you can use open-ended questions in both. You can use either-or questions in both. Implication questions can be open-ended, they can be either-or. So we wanted, and I drew the funnel where you have the open-ended questions, the either-or, and then evaluation type questions, and then the yes questions at the bottom. We didn't talk about the yes questions because those go more in the transition and the presentation. As we get into the transition process, it's important to have the right perspective. Now remember, we've done the fact-finding, we've made sure that there is a need and that our solution fits that need. Too often salespeople go into this point of the presentation hoping that they get the sale. This is where there's a big departure between a salesperson who's in a sales role, reporting to a sales manager who's always pushing urgency, versus you as an owner or a consultant or a coach or a service provider who's prioritizing the longer term relationship. Just like in the beginning, we did a pre-qualify step, and we said that there's a point where we said there's where we had to either continue or reschedule or revisit in the future. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to check the temperature. You want to make sure that they have the decision-making authority and that it fits in with their buying cycle. Now, for small ticket items, you may not have to worry about this, but if this is a large expenditure, you may want to check to see when is their window open for this kind of an expenditure. What's their level of authority? If you're in fundraising, you may want to check when do they make their strategic decisions around who they're going to donate to. If that's going to be 3 months down the road, I don't want to go forward into the presentation now, because the presentation is an emotional sale. You're tapping into human needs. Once you go through that, you don't really get to go through the presentation again. The way the human mind works, I've been there, done that. I don't need to go through it again. You may need to as the salesperson, but they don't want to, and they don't think that they need to. And so it's very difficult to get them back to that emotional point. So we want to stop here. And it might be we need to get the right people in the room. And so one of the things you could think about here is we can reschedule, we can prepare. So what I'm talking about here, let's say that they don't have the authority, and the person who has the authority, no way, no how, is going to sit down through the presentation, that they are responsible for getting the information. So in that case, I want to prepare them. So my presentation will be a little bit different. I'm figuratively, I've mentioned this before, there's shoulder to shoulder and there's face to face. Face to face can become adversarial. You want to try something, if you're ever having a difficult time seeing eye to eye, you want to come from face to face and move around to the same side of the table, the desk. Sometimes you even taking a walk. I mean, you have to pick and choose how you do this. But if you're having a difficult time getting alignment with somebody, just try this out for yourself. Go for a walk. You're shoulder to shoulder. When you are shoulder to shoulder, you're seeing the same thing. And remember, there's 100 billion neurons always firing and wiring, and you got mirror neurons interacting with each other. So there's probably much more than I can explain what happens when you go shoulder to shoulder. But trust me, you will find in this It's easier to get rapport. It's easier to get alignment when you're shoulder to shoulder. And walking is good because you're processing the information as it comes in. You're settling, you're breathing. You're allowed to pause. When you're face to face, it's difficult to take a long pause because you feel like they're waiting for an answer. But when you're walking side by side, you have a little bit more time. There's just a lot that goes on. I'm going to at least figuratively move shoulder to shoulder with the person. Ideally, I'm going to come around to the same side of the desk, but if you're on Zoom, right? But figuratively, in my mind, I could be shoulder to shoulder. And what I'm going to do is talk from that third person point of view, like I'm helping this prospect talk to their boss or whoever it is who has the responsibility, and I'm going to come out of role much more often, right? I'm going to say the reason why we want to talk about this. Now, this is the one you want to highlight and get some numbers behind this one. I'm literally preparing them for what they have to do because they're the ones who are going to be making the sale on my behalf. Or I continue. Most often, we're probably going to continue if you've done a good job of fact finding. But the other thing this does is it gives you an off-ramp and puts you in control. So you're the one who's deciding, am I going to continue? Am I going to go forward with this sale? This is why some of your sales pros can get 80 and 90% closing ratios. It's not a game. It's not a gimmick. They're weeding out the 80% who don't buy. They're making the decision up front, and that's very empowering. Now, if you're hungry for sales, it may feel difficult to do that. I encourage you to try it, even if you have to set up some extra appointments just to have that feeling of taking it away. You may have some prospects who aren't really a good match. So there's a view that I do that's like this, and you have the prospect, and I'm going to call it need payoff. So if their need payoff is high enough, you don't have to have much in the way of sales skills, and the timing could be off. If their need payoff is high, they're in. And then on the side, we have skills. We have skills and timing. Think about it like this. If they're at a 5 in the needs payoff, and you're at a 5 with skills and timing, and the timing of the decision, just like I was saying, if their time to make this sale is the beginning of the next quarter, we should put it off until the beginning of the next quarter. You want to get both of these to be above a 5 ideally, because 10 is what you need for a sale. And you can get there by having a 2 on your skills and timing, but an 8 on their need payoff. Ideally, if you can get your skills and timing up to a 7 or 8, and you do through fact finding, you're only proceeding with people who are 6 to 10 on the need payoff, this is where you can start getting your closing ratio to be closer to 80 or 90%. It doesn't mean that you're not going to talk to these people here. It just means that you're not talking to them right now. But again, you're in charge of this, and it's very empowering. We talked about autonomy. You are introducing autonomy for yourself into the sales presentation because you get to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to continue. And if you're going to continue, you're continuing because there's a real strong fit, and whether you make the sale or not, it's worth it because this person's going to benefit from the conversation. And then the other one is relatedness. Relatedness from the salesperson standpoint is important to have that intrinsic motivation. So there are people who don't like their job, obviously. And the more you can work with people that you feel something in common with, that you can relate to, that there's some bond, that relatedness puts up the intrinsic motivation. And we all have seen that, where there are people you like hanging around with, and then there are people that it's good for them to hang around with somebody else. You have the autonomy because you're making the decision. You have relatedness because you're not going to pick somebody that you don't want to talk to. You're not going to continue. You're probably going to say, you know what, we're not connected enough. I haven't gotten to the prospect need payoff. Now, there might be some times where there have been people who bought from salespeople and there's absolutely no rapport whatsoever, but they just need it so badly. But again, if you're talking about your business, especially as a coach or a consultant, there's probably some people you're not going to want to work with. And so again, you're getting the autonomy, you're getting the relatedness. So now you're entering into situations where your skills and timing are where they need to be. So you're and also getting the competence. The reason I'm pointing this out is because these are the human needs from self-determination theory, and they're shown to be what's necessary for intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is not just internal motivation, it's motivation from the activity itself. So, this is not one you want to sleep on. Autonomy, competence, and relatedness, building that into your sales presentation makes it more interesting, makes it more fun, makes it easier to become eager for that next sales presentation, as opposed to drudgery. It's like I get to do this instead of I have to do this. Big, big difference. So after you check the temperature and you're comfortable with this matrix view here, we're going to go into the demonstration. And I call it a demonstration. I don't want to trip over words. It's a presentation, but I want to impress upon the listener how important it is to involve the prospect into that conversation. You did all that work in fact finding. You've gone through the nuances. You know the implications. You want to have them seeing themselves. You want to use words like, can you imagine if, or just imagine that blah, blah, blah. Or, yeah, imagine that, you have this and it's like 6 months later. What are some of the things that you would see that are different? In order for them to answer that question, they have to put themselves into that space. Another one is, let's just say, for example, and stepping in. You are going to be involving them by demonstrating through their eyes. You're guiding them through so they could experience it internally, what it means to have that. Another thing you want to do is, in this temperature check, we want to gain some agreement, and these are often referred to as yes questions. But yes questions have become these tie downs, like that's gonna work well for you, won't it? That meets your needs, doesn't it? Or, yeah, your spouse is really going to like this car, won't she? Those tie downs are good, but what happens, they feel very salesy. I mentioned last week that to get the physiology right, I use a personal situation. If you take some feature of your product or service, you can say, that's going to make it safer, won't it? Or that'll make it easier to get started, won't it? You can clean up your physiology a little bit, tone, inflection, to mannerisms, facial expressions. You can make it sound more natural by practicing with like a friend group thing. So you could say, man, that's going to be fun, won't it? That's going to be a lot of fun, won't it? That's going to be such a blast, man. I can't wait. How about you? You want to get as many yeses as you can, because when they say yes, you're priming them. You are priming them with yes. If you get a person saying no, you're priming them with no. You get a person saying yes, you're priming them with yes. Last week I talked about a person holding a warm cup of liquid versus a cold cup of liquid and controlling the other things to be the same. When they had the warm liquid, they had a more compassionate response. It's the same thing. Yes primes the person to get ready to saying yes. I've heard one person say, if you get 45 yeses throughout a presentation, they're virtually guaranteed to buy. It's difficult to do, but yes questions are not only tie downs. They are things like, are you with me? Does it make sense? Again, if you think about with your friend group, yeah, we can get an appetizer. How about if we get an appetizer to share for the table? Does that make sense? You're just doing things that they already have told you that are important to them to get that yes. But again, I think it's really helpful with the tie downs. That's going to be fun, isn't it? That'll be fun, won't it? Won't that be fun, right? You could put the tie down in the beginning. Won't that be fun? You mix it up. Personally, I don't like recommending doing a lot of tie downs because these things have been around for so long and they're in so many canned presentations that if you're in that canned presentation mode and you're already deep into that hypnotic trance, they work really well. But if you're more into this mindfulness, which is where we have people in this kind of a framework, I think they can be overused. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to get yeses, and you're getting the yeses because you know what they said is important to them from the fact finding. Another one might be same page. We're on the same page. Then, of course, you need to set these up. You need a little preamble, et cetera, et cetera. But hopefully you're getting the idea. I told you why I use demonstration instead of presentation. So normally at this point, we'll have a close, but we're going to call it a recommendation. So in the recommendation, we're going to summarize what you heard in the fact finding, and then we're going to use a preamble, and that's why I recommend XYZ. And I say that because, remember in the cognitive biases, I talked about the because frame and the study that Robert Cialdini did, where people didn't pay attention to what came after the word because, in terms of the numbers, that compliance was achieved almost at the same level when the words behind because were essentially meaningless. Now, I'm not suggesting we put meaningless words behind here. What I'm saying is if because is that powerful, why not leverage it? Why not use it? So I recommend XYZ. And I say that because you're using the word because, so you're going to give them some evidence points. And in those evidence points, you want to use move toward and you want to use move away from. Now, by this time in the presentation, you may notice different people have a different sequence. Some people go toward, away. Some people go away, toward. It's all mixed up. But you will ask people questions and you'll notice the first thing they do is push back on it. And I can explain why that's happening from a cognitive standpoint, but it's out of scope. The point is you want to have both of those because you're building an emotion, building towards an emotional crescendo to make the sale. So you want to use some of their move toward, you want to use some of the move away. And remember the implication questions. The implication questions have literally some implications that are moving away from. They have some costs that they will incur if they don't make this decision. And so you can bring those out on the move away. So you want to have some move away from and some move toward. And then we want to also future pace. So I'm recommending it because, and then some evidence points. And then, do you see how that would work? I mean, if you had this with the fold-down seat, your bicycle fit in the back of the trunk. You don't have to worry about leaving it outside. Do you see how that makes sense for the kind of lifestyle you have? You're getting some yeses in there, and you're building the case. Now, you can do this 2 or 3 times before you go for the real close statement. I use recommendation because it's the first opportunity to buy. And it's low pressure, and it works for consultants and coaches, business owners when it's business owner to owner. It works for all those situations. And you're still closing. And then, of course, the close on the recommendation, we like to use assumptions. An assumptive close, I talked about you making the decision for whether to move ahead or not. I didn't talk so much about the perspective. Let's take a quick view of what's going on. Now, you'll recall that I said the lead generation part is out of scope, but lead generation is very important for you to look at. And we could do 2 or 3 sessions on lead generation, right? Whether it's reaching people in the DMs, whether it's email, calling, advertising, there's some kind of a lead generation process. And in that lead generation, whether it's email or ads or phone calls, cold calling, or posting on social media, whatever it is, there's some kind of a headline. And maybe there's a tagline, and basically you have the attention, interest, desire, and action, the CTA. At least you're doing the first 2, right? Attention and interest. And that's happening at some kind of a way in the ad or the email, the subject line, the first line in the email. Something's going on there to draw their attention. Well, here's what's going on. I talk a lot about the 100 billion neurons. The 100 billion neurons are essentially the subconscious. They're associated with each other. They wire together. And that's essentially what the subconscious is. And I mentioned that the philosophers and all from the 1850s to like the 1940s or so, the New Thought era, they talked a lot about what the subconscious does and doesn't do, but they were missing the scanning tools to show what parts of the brain were lighting up. So they didn't have the perspective of the 100 billion neurons, not even mirror neurons, as a matter of fact, and how the prefrontal cortex develops over time, all of that. But now that we know this, we can go back and revisit it and explain why it's working. So the subconscious processes at 11 million bits per second. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that it's super fast. The conscious mind only processes at 50 bits per second. So remember I was saying you ask why 5 times, and you get the first answer to why, the second answer to why. Those are pretty much coming out of the subconscious. Those are pretty much rehearsed or habitual, highly associated answers that just fall out. When you get past what they've thought about in the past, and you're now in conscious thinking. That's when I said the eyes might go back and forth. They might look down. They might look up. They do something. They shift. And you might even see sometimes I've seen people jerk or flush because it's a part of their belief system that's not, I'll call it reconciled, right? There's some limiting belief that maybe you tapped into or something that they've been suppressing and they're not talking about. That asking why 5 times is a really powerful tool. In coaching, I say ask 7. You don't need that to make a sale, but asking why 5 times is powerful. So we're walking around with a processing speed of 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind only has 50 bits per second. The subconscious has a reaction time that's like 0.2 of a second. The conscious mind reaction time is 0.5 of a second. So why is that important? That means that the subconscious is seeing a lot of stuff that the conscious mind is not even becoming aware of because it's just moving on. Your attention is moving on. You scan something. If nothing caught your attention, you don't even actually see it, but your subconscious picked up on it. So now you have the subconscious, and before it goes just to the conscious mind, it's also looking at the reticular activating system. And this reticular activating system is picking up, like if you were to scan the room, your reticular activating system is there to look for danger, right? You walk into a new situation, you immediately scan around to get your surroundings. Some people look for the exit doors. Some people look for where somebody might be hiding. It just depends on your training and perspective, etc. But that reticular activating system also responds based on your goals. So if you have goals and dreams and things that you talk about a lot, the RAS is constantly paying attention to what you're thinking, what you're doing, what you're saying, more so on the saying and doing. That's why affirmations out loud are better than just verbalizing them to yourself. So the reticular activating system then feeds the conscious mind. So it's the reticular activating system that might see this ad. It might see the ad and that brings it into the conscious mind. So now your conscious mind sees the headline. Now this doesn't happen obviously every single time, but this is why if you go all the way back to when they started measuring this stuff, direct response type advertising has about a 2% conversion rate. Why? I guess 2% of the people are actually in market and ready to do something. This process of the reticular activating system picking up on the ad, just think about it yourself. There have been ads forever. You can go back and look at how many times a particular ad has run, and then all of a sudden you saw it. Why did you see it? If you look at your life, you will see that there were things that you were doing. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, everything happens for a reason, or I manifested it, and I'm not going to delve into that area. It's not necessarily that you manifested it. You made it a priority. Your RAS started looking for it the same way when you set goals. You set a goal, and then this serendipity happens because the reticular activating system is paying attention to it. That's how your lead process can begin. That's important because you want to go back and see what is the first step in lead gen and take that to where you are now in the call. Something happened that made this person raise their hand and say, I am interested. That is the assumption I want you to start with. You want to start with that assumption that something happened that said, I'm interested. What you're going to do with that information is when you get into checking the temperature, when you get to here, you are looking to draw a connection and with being consistent. Remember, that's one of the factors of unconscious influence. You want to bring out that consistency cognitive bias by having them tell you why they took the call, why they reached out to you, why they, whatever it was that they did, why they responded to the email. Tell me again why you responded to that. I just want to make sure that I've covered all the bases. What made you look into us in the beginning? You could ask that question before, but I like doing it here because the consistency comes into play. You're reminding them that they started this process, not you. And because consistency says, I have to be consistent with my past actions, they're going to feel some kind of pressure. Now, are we tricking them? No. We're just telling the 100 billion neurons what to focus on now. We're bringing that into play. So hopefully that was useful. The bigger point is understand your lead generation and how that led to the call and bring that back into play as you make your recommendations and as you go into the close. This is why assumptive closing works. A lot of times you'll hear most sales training talk about using either or. You're going to pay for that by check, or we're going to put it on the card. You need to take a break before we jump into the next step, or you're ready to go. You're not asking them, sit down and go through the buying process. You're asking them something else. Is this going to be something that we bill you for, or are you going to give me a check today? You're not asking them to buy. It's the same way when you do appointments. Is Thursday in the morning or Friday afternoon better for you? It's the same thing. The answer tells you that they're moving forward. So it's an assumptive close, but I went through this because I want you to have the mindset. And remember, we made the decision whether or not we're going to go forward. So I want you to have the mindset that they are ready to buy, they're there to buy. It's not you that has to overcome their objections. They have to overcome their objections, or their reasoning, or their fears, or their concerns. People are running along, they're just going along in life, having their good old time, and then you come along with this option that's transformative, and it takes them up to here. But there's resistance. There's resistance in here. And don't take my word for it. Go back and look at your own buying situation. This resistance is happening. They have to be reassured. This is the comfort zone. And here, it's cognitive dissonance, because they're going against something that they're not comfortable with. You got the neurons wanting to have it and stay the same, and you got the conscious mind saying, I'm moving into this next step. And you get this cognitive dissonance, and because excitement has the same signature as anxiety, because it's all energy, right? You can discern it, but from a distance, if you're not thinking, if you're not mindful, and you're not understanding some of this, that cognitive dissonance that's coming from the excitement of breaking through and doing that thing you want to do actually can be interpreted as anxiety. And when it's interpreted as anxiety, the natural thing is to hesitate and resist. So this is what happened. We're going to use words like invest, get started. We're going to remind them all the things that it's doing. We're pushing the comfort zone line up. We're reminding them of how this takes care of the implications. And we're pushing up that comfort zone. So now the decision that they have to make is very small. You're literally protecting them from stepping into the cognitive dissonance. And that's that process that we go through from checking the temperature into the demonstration. And the other thing that happens is this is new and unfamiliar. And the subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as scary. So even this thing here has some emotion connected to it. I'll jump to the objections, because that's the next thing you're going to have to deal with. A quick review. We got the pre-qualify, pour and confirm alignment and readiness. That's the beginning of the framework. Open-ended questions, evaluation questions, agreement questions. That's like the yes questions. And then we went to fact-finding, part 1, situation and problem identification. That's your beginning of spin, but we're integrating with the open-ended either-or and evaluation questions. And this is all about an automobile. It's generic about an automobile, just for you to have a sense of what kind of questions you want to start working on for yourself. Fact-finding, part 2, is when we shift from situation problem to problem implication. Now we're into the problem and implication questions, open-ended questions, expanding on the problem, either or, narrowing it down. Remember, this saves you some time. Implication questions, and this gets you into highlighting the consequences of inaction. They might be buying a performance car because they like the top of the line, but there's an implication that goes with that. There's two ways of looking at the implication. One way of looking at the implication is that the maintenance costs are going to be a lot higher. There's also the other side of it. If they're saying that they're not going to get the performance car, you could remind them that, well, the performance car actually has a turbo, so you're going to be saving gas mileage as long as you're not driving like a hot rod. The point is you want to go to that next step. What's that next step for them with the decision that they're making? I mentioned moving toward and moving away from. And then we have the transition. This is where we talked about today. So summarize the need payoff. It's a temperature check. Summarize findings, confirm alignment, and ensure readiness before proceeding to the demonstration. Remember, I talked about making sure that they're the decision maker, etc. To summarize, from what you've shared, you're looking for a luxury vehicle that delivers performance, technology / and you want to ensure it's worthwhile upgrade from what you're already driving. The need payoff. Here's a need payoff example. If we could offer you a vehicle that enhances your driving experience with better performance, advanced technology, and a design that truly stands out, would that be something worth considering? Does that reach that level that says, yes, it's time to take action? Check temperature. Does that sound like the kind of upgrade that you've been looking for? Does that fit with what you came in looking for today? And this goes back to, is that what you had in mind when you first responded to the ad? Is that what you had in mind? Or is there anything else you had in mind when you agreed to take this call? And then you gain the minor commitment. If so, would you be open to exploring the specific models that best match what you want? The point is, you want to check that temperature and make sure that they're still aligned and ready to buy. Yeah, and then we have demonstration recommendation. Present the solution, tie it directly to the prospect's needs, and recommend the next steps. You present the solution, connect to the needs. This is important. Remember, we talked about making the presentation on the fly. You want to keep connecting back to the needs, do some takeaways if you have to, and then the recommendation soft close. Given everything we've covered, I'd recommend going with the luxury model number 1 over number 2. I say that because here's the evidence points. You have the option of taking delivery this afternoon or scheduling it for later this week. Do you have a preference? That's that soft close. That's that either or. You're going to have a few objections. I want to shop around a little bit more. What we're going to do with that one is, and you can map all of them to making a good decision, but because you may get 2 or 3 objections, we're going to map it to other things. But you want to address the objection using, it's called CRIC, clarify, rephrase, isolate, then confirm, resolve, close. So to clarify, that makes sense. You want to make sure you've looked at all the options. I get it. Do I have that right? I can understand that. It sounds like you're like myself and most of us. You want to know that you're making a good decision. Would you agree, or however you want to tie that down? Then you isolate it. Now, of course, there's no crystal ball, but this car checks all your top boxes, and it's the right blend of performance and convenience with the added luxury. Sounds like you got your good decision right there. Or that sounds like a pretty good decision, doesn't it? Using a tie down. And then assuming they say yes, the last thing I have to do is get some personal information that I'm missing. Is this going to be in your name or your company name? Back into that either or. We're going to map this one to meeting needs. I want to think about it. And this comes up constantly. And this goes back to what I was saying about this. There's just a lot of times that I want to think about it. It's just putting this off. Think about yourself. If you ask, and you can't do this because the person, you don't want to make them defensive, but if you could ask a person why 5 times, what do they want to think about? It's going to be very difficult for them to come up with a really good reason. They just want to think about it, which is because it's just this resistance. It's a natural habit pattern to go back, and it's safe. So what we want to do is blow through that. I completely understand. You want to be sure you're making the right decision. What's the main thing you'd like to think over? You're asking them why, but in a safer way. What's the main thing you want to think over? It sounds like you really like whatever they respond. It sounds like you really like the vehicle, but just want to be sure it's the right fit overall. Aside from wanting to think about it some more, is there anything else that's holding you back? And then you go into the confirm, resolve, close. From what we discussed, this vehicle checks all the boxes in terms of luxury, performance, back to that, right? And saves you the several $100s in fuel every month. Doesn't that make it a good decision? Doesn't that give you what you were looking for? Something like that, some kind of a yes question. Or is there anything else that you're looking for in a vehicle? And what you're doing is helping them. Instead of thinking of yourself as selling them a vehicle, you want to be imagining that you're helping them. And this one, the close was, are you writing a check or is it going on a card? It's just the either or, back to that, pretty standard. Now there is one more area that I want to talk about. Few things that you want to make a note of. One is nonverbals. Pace, tone, volume. We already talked about the energy. Pay attention to your nonverbals, and you want to be thinking in terms of this has happened. You're helping them get across that line. You're in more of a coach, tour guide mode, as I said earlier. Physiology, we hit that already. Words, I've kind of alluded to using words like invest, get started, move forward, as opposed to buy, because buy can trigger that knee-jerk response of I'll put it off. Breathing, slow down, we talked about that. Visualization, here's a big one. Visualization, and the way I talk about it, is not about manifesting. What visualization does for us is that, as I mentioned, the subconscious does not like the unfamiliar. And that unfamiliar is what causes the cognitive dissonance. What visualization does is it makes this more and more familiar. Plus, it brings the reticular activating system into play to start looking for things that are along those lines. But visualization is good. So in a sales situation, you are also going to experience some of this resistance, some of this energy that could be construed as anxiety. You want to visualize that outcome. You want to visualize for the salesperson, for the prospect, this is their transformation. For you, this is the sale. So you want to imagine the things that are happening during and after that sale is made. You want to visualize yourself entering things in the computer, or you want to visualize yourself entering your back end where you can take the payment. You want to visualize yourself thanking them and reassuring them that this is a good decision. You want to make that whatever it is. I used to visualize in life insurance days, I would visualize the person writing the check. Sometimes, you'd start to get a little bit of perspiration here. You can tell, it's getting hot in here, right? And I would instantly visualize them writing the check. Now I didn't do this because I was expecting it to have an effect on them. Now what I know about mirror neurons, there was probably something going on there, but what it did is it calmed me down. And it got me focusing on what I really want instead of all this stuff, right? Because the subconscious can be like a squirrel. It's like, what about that? What about this? What about that? And you want to be focused on, like I said, in this case, it was writing the check for the life insurance. We have positioning in space. I talked about that. Imagining yourself being shoulder to shoulder versus face to face, even if it's figuratively, even if it's using the words. Consistency, reminding them of what they said was important, reminding them, helping them, have you remind them of why they decided to do this in the first place. And then another consistency thing is asking them, for example, which one of all the things we covered, which would have the greatest positive impact on your business? And that's that need payoff, right? Now you're helping them. This is that involvement and having them get involved in the demonstration. Reciprocity, doing things for them. There are things you can do for them in the present. You can give them bits and pieces. You can send them something. You can give them a PDF. You could give them access, whatever it is. Just make sure that they know that you're giving it to them. It's reciprocity. Framing, keeping them in the right frame of mind, keeping them moving along. Buying decisions are made on emotion. Justification is done with logic, but you've got to get the emotion first. If you start with logic, it's harder to get to the emotion. Pre-framing, maybe your price is a little bit high. And so now you know that we are a premium provider. And so if you just compare this on price, you're going to miss the boat, because that premium allows us to put these other benefits in there. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I have to ask you some of these questions, because we do pack in other benefits, and it's going to make your life a lot easier once you have this. Something like that. You're pre-framing them so that they don't have sticker shock when they see the price. And then there's reframing. So there's setting the frame, so it's the right frame. It's pre-framing to make sure that they step into the right frame when you get to that point. And then there's reframing. And you can reframe the context, or you can reframe the meaning. And then I talked about helping them to decide. So that's it. Next week we're going to go back to that. I'll go back to that diamond with the state, the physiology, the energy, and the mindset, and I'll use that as the model. What are some of the things you can do to manage your own state? I already started touching on it a little bit here with the visualization, but we're going to get to where you are no longer concerned, and you no longer have any reluctance, or you don't have the concern about any anxiety taking off and running. So we'll see you next week, same time, same place.